Hello, my name is Isaac Castillo, and I am the Director of Outcomes, Assessment, and Learning at Venture Philanthropy Partners Raise DC. In this short video, I'm going to share some of the results from a study we completed in partnership with Child Trends that examined the effects of the coronavirus pandemic using data from the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey. As a supplemental resource, you can access the full report, The True Cost of the Pandemic, an analysis of the disparities of our lived experiences, at VPP+Raise DC. Our study focused on households with children in the greater Washington, D.C. region, as well as households with 18 to 24-year-olds. Before sharing the results of our study, I want to first provide a short introduction to Venture Philanthropy Partners Raise DC, which I'll refer to as VPP+Raise DC. In April 2020, Venture Philanthropy Partners integrated with Raise DC, creating a new strategic vision to act as a regional backbone with an investment fund to support children and young adults as well as their families. VPP+Raise DC's work focuses on three core areas. First, early childhood education. Second, career and college readiness. And third, boys and young men of color. A philanthropic investment organization, VPP+Raise DC envisions a future where all young people have the opportunity to succeed and contribute to the productivity, health, and well-being of the greater Washington region. We strive to ensure that every young person in our region has access to quality healthcare, post-secondary education, and meaningful career opportunities. With that background on VPP+Raise DC in mind, let's now get to the study itself. We partnered with Child Trends to analyze data from the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey, which I'll refer to as the Pulse Survey for the remainder of this video. The Pulse Survey collects data on the effects of the coronavirus pandemic nationwide. It is a data collection effort that is separate from the decennial census, but it is also administered by the Census Department. All of the data from the Pulse Survey is publicly available on the Census website. The Census Department continues to administer the Pulse Survey as of the date of this recording. However, our analysis focused on Pulse Survey data from April 23, 2020 to March 1st of 2021. The Pulse Survey data is reported for the United States as a whole and for selected areas throughout the country. Data for our region is reported by what is commonly referred to as the Washington, Arlington, Alexandria Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is frequently shortened to the Washington MSA. The Washington MSA includes the District of Columbia, 5 counties in Maryland, 12 counties and 6 cities in Virginia, and 2 counties in West Virginia. There have been many studies and news stories that have focused on the effects of the pandemic, including the effects on our region. However, the vast majority of these have highlighted challenges faced by adults or have focused on children's virtual learning experiences. In our study, we looked at 2 additional groups. First, we looked at the effects of the pandemic on households with children. These are households with 1 or more children aged 0 to 17 living within the household. For the remainder of this video, and in associated materials, we refer to this group as families. Second, we looked at households where the person responding to the Pulse Survey was between the ages of 18 and 24. We identified these 2 groups for study to help our region better understand how families and young adults are affected by the pandemic. We also wanted to better understand the household conditions that children and young adults face during the pandemic, knowing that these experiences affect how the youngest populations in our region recover from the pandemic. Our analysis supports many of the findings of previous studies of the pandemic's effects, namely that certain populations and groups experience disproportionate negative effects during the pandemic when compared to others. Many African American and Latinx families in our region faced hunger, housing, employment, and educational challenges which were worsened by the pandemic. Many of these families were struggling pre-COVID, and the pandemic will make it even more difficult to obtain consistent meals, stable housing, and uninterrupted employment and education. Furthermore, Asian American and Pacific Islander families in our region experience challenges in different ways compared to other groups. In most cases, our findings for Asian American and Pacific Islander households with children mirrored those of white households with children. However, in a few instances, Asian American and Pacific Islander families faced even greater challenges than other groups. we recognize that the Asian American and Pacific Islander populations in our region are not monolithic, and that thousands of Asian American and Pacific Islander families likely face challenges similar to those of African American and Latinx families in our region. In this video, we share data for Asian American and Pacific Islander households with children when it differs by more than 3 percentage points when compared to white households. Our study faced substantial limitations due to the nature of the Pulse Survey data. The most significant challenge we faced was in the race and ethnicity data. The Pulse Survey only asked about the race and ethnicity of the person completing the survey. It did not ask about the race and ethnicity of people within the household. In order to share our findings by race and ethnicity, we made a large assumption. We assumed that the race and ethnicity of the survey respondent represented the same race and ethnicity of the entire household, including children in the household. We understand that this assumption creates several flaws with the analysis. It assumes that an entire household is made up of the same race or ethnicity. It also minimizes the presence of multiracial and multi-ethnic families. However, given the nature of the Pulse Survey and how it was administered, we believe that this was the only way we could present data broken out by race and ethnicity. And we believe that there are some very important findings when the data is disaggregated by race and ethnicity. As discussed previously, we share data when available for the Asian American and Pacific Islander populations, and when it varies from white households. However, there are a few instances where the number of households identifying as Asian American or Pacific Islander were too small to generate statistically reliable estimates. We also attempted an examination of how the pandemic affected households where the survey respondent was 18 to 24 years old. Unfortunately, the number of these types of households in the Pulse Survey dataset was very low, and in most cases, we could not generate reliable estimates for this population by race and ethnicity. Finally, it is important to point out that the U.S. Census considers the Pulse Survey still as an experimental data product, meaning that it does not currently meet the statistical confidence thresholds for other census datasets. While the data may not be as representative and comprehensive as possible, the rapid availability of findings related to the pandemic provides us with the opportunity to understand trends in regional households quickly. Now, it is time to turn to the results of our analysis. We will share these findings in 4 different groupings: food insecurity, housing, employment and income, and education. The findings we share within these groups are those that we feel needed to be highlighted and raised up. Thousands of data points that could have been discussed, and in the interest of openness and transparency, we're sharing all of the data tables and estimates created as part of this study on our website. Let's begin with an examination of our food insecurity findings. Our first finding focuses on families that reported that they did not have enough to eat during the 7 days prior to completing the Pulse Survey. As a reminder, when I say family, that is shorthand for households in our region that have at least one child under the age of 18. We found that 11% of all households with children in the region reported that they sometimes or frequently did not have enough to eat during the 7 days prior to responding to the Pulse Survey. However, there was great variation among subgroups of households with children. Only 4% of white households with children reported that they frequently or sometimes did not have enough to eat during the previous 7 days. In African American families, 19% reported some level of food insecurity in our region. Similarly, 20% of Latinx families reported that they frequently or sometimes did not have enough to eat. The Pulse Survey also asked families about their perception of being able to afford food over the next 4 weeks. Overall, 9% of families reported that they did not think they could afford the food they needed over the next 4 weeks. When breaking out these responses by race and ethnicity, we found that 3.4% of white families expressed concern about affording food. In comparison, 14.8% of African American families did not think they could afford the food they needed over the next 4 weeks. Similarly, 15.4% of Latinx families answered the same way. And 6.7% of Asian American and Pacific Islander families expressed that they did not think they could afford the food they needed over the next 4 weeks. In addition to food insecurity, many families dealt with challenges related to their housing. These challenges including struggling to maintain their housing, such as staying current with rent and mortgage payments, as well as the stress of living in crowded housing conditions during a pandemic with a highly contagious virus. We'll begin by looking at those families in the region that rent their homes. The percentage of families that rent their homes is an important factor to consider, as these families did not have the ability to draw on a significant asset during economic hardship. Overall, 31% of families in our region rent their homes, but as with food insecurity, this varies based on race and ethnicity of the household. 17.5% of white families rented their homes according to the Pulse Survey analysis. However, 44.5% of Latinx families rented their homes, and 48.5% of African American families reported the same according to the Pulse Survey. The Pulse Survey also asked respondents about the nature of their living situation, with a focus on conditions that may increase the likelihood that households were exposed to the coronavirus. Specifically, the Pulse Survey asked respondents to report on whether they were living in a multifamily dwelling or if they lived in overcrowded housing situations. Let's start with a look at families living in apartments or multifamily housing. 9% of white families lived in an apartment or multifamily dwelling in our region. In comparison, 31% of African American families in the region lived in apartments or multifamily dwellings. Similarly, 27% of Latinx families lived in these settings, and 13% of African American and Pacific Islander families lived in apartments or multifamily dwellings. The Pulse Survey also asked respondents to share how many people lived in their household, as well as how many bedrooms were in their home. Using this data, we calculated the rate of household members per bedroom in each household. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development defines a household as overcrowded if it has more than 2 people per bedroom. Using this definition, we calculated how many families were living in overcrowded housing conditions in our region based on the Pulse Survey. We found that 2.7% of white families lived in overcrowded housing. This compares to 10% of African American families and 14.5% of Latinx families living in overcrowded housing situations. 4.6% of Asian American and Pacific Islander families also lived in overcrowded housing conditions. These findings point to the increased potential risk of exposure to the coronavirus among African American and Latinx families in our region when compared to white families. The pandemic also created complications for some households with children as they struggled to make timely housing payments. For all households with children in the region, 22% reported that they had low or no confidence in their ability to make their next rent or mortgage payment. However, only 7.8% of white families in the region stated that they had low or no confidence in their ability to make their next housing payment. This contrasts with 43% of Latinx households with children reporting they had low or no confidence in their ability to make their next rent or mortgage payment. Similarly, 35% of African American families expressed doubt about making their next housing payment. The pandemic also resulted in many families losing employment income. As the coronavirus spread across the region, many employers shut down or drastically reduced their hours, which in turn led to fewer employment opportunities and hours worked. Many of the challenges that families in the region faced during the pandemic were rooted in losses of employment income. For all households with children in the region, 46% experienced some loss of employment income during the pandemic. However, in a trend that we continue to see within our study, this finding differed based on the race and ethnicity of the family. According to our analysis, 34% of white families experienced a loss of employment income during the pandemic. In contrast, 53.7% of African American families experienced loss of income during the pandemic, while 64% of Latinx families also experienced losses of income. In many cases, this loss of employment income during the pandemic was driven by community shutdowns early in the pandemic. These shutdowns severely limited or eliminated many employment opportunities that were based on in-person interactions. Certain families could easily transition to virtual or remote work, but those that worked in industries such as retail or construction often struggled. During the pandemic, close to 59% of households in the region with children had at least one adult shift some or all of their traditional in-person work to telework during the pandemic. For white families in the region with children, 73% had at least one of the adults in the household shift to telework. In contrast, 48% of African American families in the region had at least one adult shift to telework, while only 38% of Latinx households with children in the region responded similarly. 65.5% of Asian American and Pacific Islander households with children in the region reported having at least one adult shift to telework during the pandemic. The Pulse survey also asked households about their expected loss of future income due to the pandemic. Overall, 31% of households with children in the region expected an adult in their household would lose employment income during the next 4 weeks due to the pandemic. As with previous findings, this differs substantially when we disaggregate by race and ethnicity. 20% of white families expected to lose employment income in the next 4 weeks due to the pandemic. However, nearly half of Latinx families reported expected losses of employment income, and 38.4% of African American families also reported an expected loss of employment income over the next 4 weeks. Losses of income and limited ability to transition employment to telework likely led to decreased confidence in a household's ability to cover common household expenses, such as food, rent, car payments, student loan payments, or medical expenses. During the pandemic, 34% of households in the region with children reported that they found it somewhat difficult or very difficult to pay for common household expenses over the preceding 7 days. Nearly 19% of white families reported difficulty paying for household expenses. In contrast, 49% of African American families in the region found it somewhat difficult or very difficult to pay common household expenses. And 52% of Latinx families reported having difficulty paying for these expenses. 21% of Asian American and Pacific Islander families reported difficulty in paying household expenses during the 7 days prior to completing the Pulse survey. For some families, these losses of employment income led to struggles with paying rent, finding food, paying for other household expenses. This exacerbated other challenges, such as living in dense or overcrowding housing conditions, which made it more likely that these families were exposed to COVID-19. While the pandemic forced some adults to switch to a virtual environment for work, nearly all children in the region were forced to experience a digital or remote learning environment. Some children struggled with this transition due to limited access to devices and consistent internet. Furthermore, even in instances where devices and internet access were provided to students, the lack of supportive guidance to parents and guardians on how to use these devices for virtual learning limited their utility. While most children in the region always had consistent access to a computer or device and an internet connection for educational purposes, many others did not, despite the best efforts by local governments and school systems. In this final section, we will share some findings related to how the pandemic affected children's learning environments. We will begin by examining how students were able to access the virtual learning space with a look at how many households with children had consistent access to computers and internet. Just over 85% of white households with children had a computer or device that was always available for children in the household for educational purposes. However, only 75.5% of African American families had computers or devices always available for children in the household. And just under 71% of Latinx households had consistent availability of learning devices for children. Similarly, 87% of white households with children had internet always available for children in the household for educational use. But just under 77% of African American families had internet always available for children for educational purposes, and that value was only 72% for Latinx families. These findings point to a group of children that struggled accessing the virtual learning space during the pandemic, likely leading to learning loss or decreased academic achievement. The pandemic also led many to cancel plans to take post-secondary classes. Overall, 34% of households in the region with children reported having at least one member of the household canceling all plans to attend post-secondary classes. Just under 30% of white households with children reported having at least one person cancel post-secondary plans. In contrast, just under 40% of African American families and 46% of Latinx families reported having at least one person cancel post-secondary classes during the pandemic, with just over 22% of Asian American and Pacific Islander families reporting the same. Our report examined how children and their families experience the pandemic and how many families will continue to struggle with its effects long after it ends. For many, the end of the pandemic will not signal a return to normal. Rather, it will be the start of a much more difficult journey. As a reminder, you can access the full report, The True Cost of the Pandemic, an analysis of the disparities of our lived experiences, at VPPartners.org, as well as all of the data tables that were used to inform this analysis. Thank you for your time today.